flights. The violence which erupted amid the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza prompted Tel Aviv to call on Moscow to protect its citizens. As the chaos unfolded, some protesters even ran onto the runway. Then, late on Sunday, Russian aviation agency announced that the airport had been freed from the mob and would remain closed until the 6th of November. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office has urged Russian authorities to protect all Israeli citizens and all Jews. Now, the war that began with attacks on Israel by Hamas continues to rage on. Protests erupted across the globe in support for the Palestinian people. What happens next? And will the global outrage have any bearing on the situation on ground? To discuss this further, we have with us Greg Swenson, international affairs expert, joining us from London. Sir, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here, Anne. Thanks.
Now, protests have erupted all across the globe. Perhaps the most deliberate show of force and people's agitation was witnessed at the demonstrations at Dagestan's main airport. What's your take on the hostility towards Israelis and Jews? There seems to be a shift here in perspectives.
Yeah, there is. There seems to be some protests, as we saw over the weekend, all over the West, as well as in the global South. If you look at Russia specifically, I mean, they're part of this axis of the opponents of the West. Basically Iran, China, and Russia seem to be joined at the hip. So it's quite natural perhaps for Russians who get their news, a lot of propaganda from the government, that they would be against Israel, and they have a history of pogroms in Russia as well. So there has been an anti-Semitic element in Russia for generations, which is challenging because there are so many Russian Jews that live in Israel and are dual citizens, and that's part of the problem here. So look, I'm not surprised. The way that the mainstream media in the West has really been hostile to Israel and created this moral relativism when there really shouldn't be in a situation like this. But you have children being taught to hate the West, to hate Jews, and Israel basically is a Western country, although located in the Middle East, obviously. But it does look like a Western country or a Western democracy. And then you have university students being taught by radical professors to hate Israel and to hate Jews. And so this shouldn't be a surprise. You're seeing this in American universities for sure. There is pushback from the center, and I don't think that these radical leftists will succeed in maintaining this hostility to Israel. I mean, they'll try their best, but they're being helped by the universities. They're being helped by the mainstream media, who for example, with the hospital bombing, who embraced the hospital bombing story. You had politicians in the U.S., just one or two actually, that embraced that story. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib both went with the hospital bombing story, and that was really outrageous. The AP, for example, posted that story that the Israelis had bombed the hospital. They got 13 million views on Twitter, and when they retracted it a day or so later, they only got 200,000 views. So this is what this is what Israel is fighting against. A real bias by the mainstream media in the West. The BBC only just recently agreed to use the word terrorist to describe Hamas, and that's really a shame that it took that long.
Sir, the Dagestan government appealed to those involved to stop their illegal acts despite anger over what it dubbed as inhumane massacre of civilian population, the Palestinian people. As I mentioned earlier, a statement by Prime Minister Netanyahu's office also said, I'm quoting here in fact, Israel expects the Russian authorities to protect all Israeli citizens and all Jews and to act decisively against the rioters and against incitement to violence against Jews and Israelis. So how do you see the situation unfolding here?
Well, I hope that the Russian government agrees to do that. It doesn't seem like much of a request from Netanyahu. I mean, it seems like a very simple request. They're not asking for military support, or they're not even asking for aid. And so it seems outrageous with this moral relativism that we have to be arguing for the safety of Jewish people and the safety of Israelis. And so I just think, again, this anti-Western bias is troubling. And I think you also have to point to, going back to the protests, you have to point to the immigrants that are taught from birth to hate the West and to hate Jews and to hate Israel. And they're not integrating into the societies that they move to. We see that here in England, where a lot of the protesters are would be arrested if they misgendered someone, but they're not arrested if they're flying a Hamas flag. And so, these kind of things are inconsistent. I hope that the Russians do the right thing, and I think, and hopefully we'll see the same sort of reaction from governments in the West.
So let's also talk about Israel's ground operation. As the situation in Gaza spirals out of control, hostage situation, aid to Gaza, these are pressing concerns which haven't been effectively dealt with. What sort of course of action would you say is required in this regard?
Well, I think the West is trying its best. Obviously, the UN is trying to bring supplies to Gaza. The U.S. has committed $100 million. I'm not sure that's wise because most of that will go to Hamas. Right now, Hamas is armed. They also have plenty of food and plenty of fuel, and yet the people in Gaza are not getting the supplies that are being shipped to Gaza from Egypt. So, this is all on Hamas. This has nothing to do with support or humanitarian support or aid from the West. The West is trying to aid those people. And of course, Hamas is using them as human shields. They're not allowing American citizens to leave Gaza. There are 600 American citizens in Gaza, most of whom work for humanitarian groups that are trying to help the people, and they're being used as human shields. So, this is all on Hamas. Again, the moral relativists in the media are trying to paint this as, two sides or two stories. It's really not. Hamas is using their own people as human shields. In fact, there was a hospital in Israel that was bombed by a rocket from Gaza, last week, a Hamas rocket from Gaza. Not a word about that in the mainstream media. So this is a really unfortunate situation where people are not getting the facts. And the fact is there's plenty of aid that's trying to make its way to Gaza, but it's being blocked by Hamas.
Sir, I believe the concern at this point, of course, as you mentioned as well, is that civilian lives are at risk. What would you say are Israel's broader objectives? Can we expect a ceasefire anytime soon?
Yeah, it's again, it's a shame that they're forced into this. They are trying their best to reduce civilian casualties. It is, unfortunately part of war where there's collateral damage, but the Israelis have begged the Gazans to move out of northern Gaza or eastern Gaza so that they can make sure that there's as few civilian casualties as possible. They use knock bombs, which are basically designed to drop on rooftops, shake the building, and warn people to leave if it's a target. But again, Hamas is using civilian shields. They're launching rockets from schools, from mosques, from hospitals, and that forces the Israelis into a really difficult situation. But again, Hamas is still firing rockets at Israel. They've killed women and children and elderly, and they've taken hostages. This is something that the Israelis have no choice but to defend themselves and to try to find the perpetrators of these of this genocidal crime.
And as the fighting rages on that front, clashes along the Lebanon-Israel border between Hezbollah and Israel have intensified as well. Fears of a wider conflagration persist. What's your take on this?
Yeah, look, I think the Hezbollah is probably waiting for the right moment to escalate. I know that they're firing rockets, which they always do. So, this is something, again, that the media doesn't like to admit. But both Hezbollah and Hamas continue to fire rockets on civilian targets. And I think that's another message that's being missed in the mainstream media, that again, choosing to criticize Israel for, even though Israel is not targeting civilians, they're targeting military installations that have human shields, unfortunately. And again, they're doing their best to avoid that, while at the same time, Hezbollah and Hamas continue to fire rockets into civilian areas in Israel. So it's really, again, not a two-sided story. This is not, two sides. This is a very much a one-sided situation.
Right. Well, Mr. Greg Swenson, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond with your
Thanks,
perspective
Sean.
and insights on this.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has warned the West that the escalation of the conflict with Russia in the Ukraine war threatens a direct military clash between nuclear powers. Shoigu is in Beijing on a working visit and is attending the Shangshan Security Forum. Now, according to Russian media, the forum is attended by representatives of defense ministers and leading experts from the countries of the Asia-Pacific region, as well as a number of European countries. Now, Shoigu at the forum claimed that the West intends to inflict strategic defeat on Russia in a hybrid war.
Провоцируя острый кризис в Европе, Запад стремится распространить конфликтный потенциал на Азиатско-Тихоокеанский регион, причем
This comes a day after Russia said that its forces shot down several Ukrainian fighter jets. Ukraine, on the other hand, claimed to have hit Russia's artillery system. The Russian Defense Ministry reported that its forces have repelled multiple attacks by the Ukrainian army in Kupiansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and other directions. Now, according to the White House, Russian forces have kept pushing this week near the ruined Donetsk city of Avdiivka, suffering heavy losses. It added that the vast front line in Ukraine has moved little in the past year, despite Kiev's grueling months-long offensive. Meanwhile, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said that Russia and Ukraine are locked in a stalemate on the front lines of their war. He added that the two sides need to sit down and negotiate an end to the conflict.
And well, Russia seems to be bypassing Western sanctions and ramping up the production of the Dagger hypersonic missiles. As per independent investigative reports, Russia is boosting the production of the Kinzhal or the Dagger missiles with the help of a network of European